a great privilege and an immense pleasure to host Omar Barghouti at the University of Toronto tonight. Omar comes to us from Montreal, where he's attended an international boycott, divestment and sanctions conference on the campaign he co-founded back in 2005. Omar has published widely on the philosophy and practice of civil disobedience and grassroots activism. He has contributed to the edited volume, Controversies and Subjectivity of 2005. His most recent book-length publication is Boycott, Divestissement, Sanctions, BDS contre l'apartheid et l'occupation en Palestine, published by Lux Editor in 2010, this year, just out. He is a seasoned public debater and indefatigable traveler for the Palestinian cause. I think it's fair to speculate that if he were campaigning for Darfur, he'd be on Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential people. The question of whether violence is legitimate was debated heatedly and openly around the world. In a famous 1967 debate, this question had pitted Noam Chomsky against Hannah Arendt. In it, Chomsky makes a qualified Fanonian argument that if violence, especially of the tactical kind, frees the oppressed from bondage and their sense of inferiority, then there would be, he said, a pretty good case for it. Arendt, who held early that Zionism was imperialism, was no friend of student mobilization and rejected there and all forms of anti-colonial violence. But both shared an unconditional preference for non-violent civil disobedience. I am struck by how much cachet violence had in those days, how much it got done, and how much recognition it got. The Palestinian Revolution, most notably, catapulted Yasser Arafat in front of the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1974, which recognized the Palestinians' right to exist as a people. Since these debates on and practices of violence 40 years ago, tolerance of violent struggles for the right to self-determination has evaporated, proportionate with the tolerance of American and Israeli state violence. This shift has hit the PLO hard and forced it to beg for a state, any state really, in Palestine, at the expense of the moral and legal force of its cause. Because of this substitution, the PLO has ceased to represent the Palestinian liberation struggle since Arafat's death in 2003, if not long before, during the ill-fated Oslo years. Hamas has come in to fill this void of violent struggle. But now Palestine's geographical fragmentation is mirrored by its political fragmentation, all the while Israel destroys Palestinian life, land, and statehood. The result of this deplorable state of affairs is that the so-called two-state solution, based on UN resolutions and demarcations, has become all but a pipe dream that will turn into the nightmare of population exchange once implemented. Over 1 million Israeli Palestinians and over 250,000 Israeli settlers will be forced across the mutually incarcerating prison wall that seals off the two communities. It is in the shadow of these developments that the Palestinian campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel has gained momentum and regained the dignity of the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. Initially co-founded by Omar Barghouti and other Palestinian civil society activists, and based in Palestine in 2005, the campaign has become a global movement. At a conference in Beirut a couple of weeks ago, I asked a Palestinian professor of history from Najaf University in Nablus whether he was in favor of the BDS activities. The elder gentleman replied, "We are very proud of these activities. You know, these days we have some Israeli colleagues who want to work with us." And we asked them, where were you when we were under siege and when your tanks entered our city? I then wondered whether he knew that the BDS campaign was actually initiated in the West Bank. To my surprise, he was surprised. He did not know this, and his warm eyes glowed even more. Now this may mean at least a couple of things. One, that the BDS campaign has not affected the occupied territories and the Arab world as much as it has affected the West, although most recently, if one follows the news, the agricultural boycott of Israel by West Bankers has had some considerable traction. The professor's reaction may also allude to the nature of global movements, like the BDS, whose very universalization obscures its point of origin. Postal workers, labor unions, writers, musicians, queers, and a growing number of leading post-colonial scholars have joined or supported the BDS movement. Most recently, and to my surprise, the historical anthropologist Anwar Stoller has issued a strong letter of solidarity. As Omar will elaborate much more in a moment, the BDS campaign aims to bring about the end of Israeli occupation and champions the Palestinian right of return. And its weapons are public campaigns that raise awareness and pressures businesses, schools, and governments to distance themselves from Israel. What accounts for its popularity? And what causes Israeli government officials to consider this movement, which by 1970s standards is exceedingly liberal, as more dangerous than the Hamas government in Gaza? The way I see it, both its popularity and the Israeli counterinsurgency are a reflection of the way the BDS campaign manages to recapture the moral high ground of the Palestinian struggle. First, it does so by adhering strictly to non-violent forms of civil disobedience, as well as consumer and labor mobilization. Second, it appeals to the historical antecedent of the successful anti-apartheid movement against the South African regime, making a convincing case for the comparability of the Palestinian and Black South African experience. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it is based on universal principles of equal rights, or in Arendtian terms, of the Palestinian right to have rights. As I've recently argued in Beirut, these are not in principle and in mode of propagation radical ideas or demands. On the contrary, they actually sit quite comfortably with Arendtian liberalism. For it seems to me that the BDS campaign does not seek validation from Israel, as the PLO does, nor does it seek to inflict little defeats on Israel, as Hamas does. Instead, it is ultimately premised on a binational sharing of one and the same land. Now the question I have to Omar is whether this noble idea of victors and victims sharing one land is in fact best served by the so-called one-state solution, as many in the BDS campaign seem to think. It is not that there have not been one-state precedents going back to pre-1948. And I pose this question not because I side with those whose Chandler's above-mentioned piece rightly dismissed as civility-stability themes. Rather, it seems to me that a single state will lead to neither political nor economic sovereignty for Palestinians, but to a form of assimilation that negates their inalienable right to self-determination. As Raz Krakotskin has recently argued, even the two-state solution demands a binational position. In other words, the universal appeal of the BDS campaign hinges on the desire to transform both the Palestinian and Israeli political system into a secular politics of equality.